Welcome to another episode of Trope Turnaround, where we take a common but underutilized trope from fiction and try to create a story with that trope as the central element. This episode will be looking at the Planet of Hats. You have a Planet of Hats when a group, culture, or planet are all assigned the same set of defining characteristics or a common theme. Personally, I like to split this trope into 4 sub-tropes, those being the thematic Planet of Hats, the perceived Planet of Hats, the historical Planet of Hats, and the Planet of Hats resulting from lazy writing. For this video, we'll be ignoring that last one. The first half of this video will be describing and analyzing 1 or 2 examples of thematic, perceived, and historical Planets of Hats in various media. Then the second half will take what we learned and try to make a Planet of Hats the central element of a story. So starting with the thematic Planet of Hats, in which either the common characteristics of a group are tightly linked with the themes of the narrative, or each group within the story is assigned a particular theme. A good example of the former is George Orwell's 1984, which uses the people's love of Big Brother and willingness to accept a stifling totalitarian regime as a warning against political cults of personality. To further reinforce this theme, 2 of the main characters are tortured for their dissenting thoughts regarding the party and Big Brother, until they also come to love Big Brother. Oh, and spoilers for a 74-year-old book, I guess. I personally wouldn't recommend 1984 because it has a sad ending, and I much prefer happy endings, but it was a good example in this instance. The Hunger Games, the first book, not the 2 sequels, by Suzanne Collins, provides an example of groups being assigned themes. Each of the 12 districts and the capital provide a specific resource with their entire culture centered around it. This is explained as a way to maintain order and keep the population in line, but also appears to have caused complete stagnation of society due to a lack of communication between intellectually diverse people. The Planet of Hats is represented as an unambiguously bad idea from a regime primed to collapse. Next, we'll look at the perceived Planet of Hats, and I'm sure I'm about to make a whole lot of people mad. My examples for this are The Lord of the Rings and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yes, Tolkien wrote a Planet of Hats. I will fight you. Let me explain. The worlds of both The Lord of the Rings and Avatar: The Last Airbender are perceived planets of hats. What this means is that the protagonists, perhaps even the audience surrogates, have prejudiced ideas of the various groups in that world that are contradicted by the vast majority of the characters we meet from those groups. The perceived Planet of Hats is a trope built on telling the audience one thing, then repeatedly showing us something else. Most notably in The Lord of the Rings, we are led to believe that elves are an arrogant and decadent society in decline due to their refusal to change with the times. While it is true that the elves are in decline, those we meet are rarely as arrogant as they've been made out to be, and typically not particularly decadent at all. Rather, they're very content living off the land if the need arises. Similarly, we're led to believe the dwarves are foolish cave dwellers, when in fact the majority of dwarves we meet are intelligent and sociable, if a little rough around the edges. Avatar: The Last Airbender does something very similar with its 4 nations. In the opening titles, we're told that the Fire Nation are the enemy, and everyone else is a victim. Yet most characters we meet are just trying to get by. Like the prison guards when Sokka and Zuko infiltrate the Fire Nation prison. They're just doing a job and don't seem to particularly care about the war one way or the other. Sometimes our expectations are completely inverted, like in the case of Jet, who is happy to commit war crimes to rid his home of Fire Nation troops. Finally, we have the historical Planet of Hats, which assigns characteristics to periods of time rather than groups of people. But this will turn to reality rather than fiction. Society tends to have generalized ideas of historical periods and cultures. For example, ancient Greece is seen as an age of enlightenment, where science and technology were at the forefront of society and democracy saw its foundations, when in fact this is far from the truth. Ancient Greeks had varying priorities. The only city-state with a democratic system was Athens, in which only male citizens could vote, and slavery was alive and well. Similarly, the Middle Ages are often considered to be a time of extreme poverty and technological decline after the fall of Rome. even though much of the technology in Europe had advanced well beyond Roman times and continued to develop. Crop rotations were a product of the Middle Ages, as were advanced water and windmills, as well as the first reading glasses and Arabic numerals, often better known as the base 10 number system. Avatar: The Last Airbender also uses this version of the Planet of Hats trope. We're told that prior to the war, all four nations lived in harmony, as if the past is some golden age when everything was fine. But throughout the show, as we glean snippets of the adventures of previous avatars, we realize that couldn't be further from the truth. The world was always in turmoil, there were just people willing to fight to keep it from complete chaos. Now we move on to the second part of the video, where we try to turn the Planet of Hats trope into the central element of a story. We've seen the Planet of Hats employed as a thematic device in 1984 and The Hunger Games. We've seen it used as a world-building tool to make fantasy worlds feel more real, with character prejudices being regularly contradicted in Lord of the Rings and Avatar: The Last Airbender. And we've all experienced the Planet of Hats we often apply to our own history. I'm going to try to incorporate all three of these variants into the same story. This means our world needs a strong theme, or set of themes, multiple cultures, and a volatile history. I think the themes of fear and prejudice lend themselves very well to this trope, so let's start there. Perhaps we have a large river delta with 5 distinct sections and a city in each one. Surrounding each city is a forest that extends to the ocean on one side and beyond the fork of the river on the other. All their lives, the inhabitants of the cities have learned that the other 4 want nothing more than to do them harm. And so despite each individual city's growing overpopulation problem, they don't dare expand to the more fertile lands on the banks of the river, because that would mean leaving themselves exposed to their neighbors. Nor do they dare to venture to the ocean where there are plenty of fish to be had, or beyond the fork of the river where the forest ends and the land is ripe for cultivation, because the soldiers of all 4 enemy cities await them there ready to pounce at a moment's notice. And so despite their increasingly dwindling supply of food and shelter, each city sends their bravest out into the forest to hunt and gather what there is no space to grow. And if they should see someone from another city, do not hesitate. Always shoot first, or you won't live to see tomorrow. The westernmost city is known as the City of Poison, where they spend all their time researching new ways to kill and inventing new weapons to use against their prey. The central city is known as the City of Blood, where savages hone their skills with blade and bow to kill quickly, precisely, silently. You never know where they might be lurking. The easternmost city is known as the City of Stone, where great and terrible machines built to crack the earth will crack your skull just as fast. The second city in the east is known as the City of Cunning, where detailed records are kept of their enemies' movements, searching for a weakness to exploit, watching and waiting until the time is right to invade. Finally, the second city in the west is known as the City of Fire, where they have explosives that could burn down the whole forest if they ever feel threatened. We're going to have 2 main characters, both sent out by their cities to refresh their dwindling food supplies, but there's nothing to be found. None of the trees have regrown their fruit, and the animals are nowhere to be seen. Don't go to the river, they've been told, but they have to. There's nothing else left. The woman from the City of Fire breaks through the tree line at the same moment as the man from the City of Poison. She raises her gun. He raises his bow, both with shaking hands and wide eyes. Everyone knows someone who didn't come back. They both hesitate. 1 second. 2. They could have killed each other by now. He lowers his bow. She lowers her gun. Relief. Why? He doesn't wait to find out. He turns and runs back into the forest. They're both sent out again the next day. Maybe the other would return. They do. Neither raises their weapon, but both are still too afraid to speak. On the 3rd day, she works up the nerve to ask, "Why didn't you kill me?" She already knows the answer but wants to hear it. Because I was scared. Scared of what? That you might be like me. On the fourth day, he offers to bring her back to his city. There are so many people, no one will question one more. She expects a city filled with poisonous gas where the streets run with acid and plague doctors pluck people off the streets to test new concoctions. Instead, she's met with a city much like her own. The houses are the same style even. The difference? The sick and injured have somewhere to go. There's a hospital in the middle of the city where doctors work on treatments and antidotes. In the middle of her city, there are windmills that turn turbines to provide electrical light and warmth. This city has no such luxury. All their light comes from candles and oil lamps, and their warmth from hearths that breathe smoke out chimneys. The smoke she always assumed was poison. That night he wonders if the stories are really true. Once there had been a single great city, until a ball of fire fell from the sky, right into the fork of the river. The fire poisoned the water, and only those who fled to the hospital were spared, where they dug wells to access fresh water from the ground. The rest went mad, hyper-focusing on killing those left sane, thus ending the Golden Age. Surely you don't need a hospital to find a different water source. Come to think of it, what does medicine have to do with sourcing water anyway? On the fifth day, he voices his thoughts, and she reveals she was taught a very similar story. That at the end of the Golden Age, those who retreated to the power plant used the electricity to power machines to dig wells to access groundwater. The rest went mad. Over the next few weeks, the pair starts to investigate. They travel to the fork of the river, where the river widens into a crater before splitting into 5 streams. Something definitely fell from the sky. They travel to the ocean, where they find docks crumbling into ruin, a port where boats once were tied but now sit on the ocean floor, visible through the crystal clear water. At this point, both their worlds have been turned inside out. They can't take the secrecy anymore. They confront their respective governments expecting a nefarious plot, but find confusion instead. I've been there, they're just like us, she tells them. There's no hyper-focus, just people living their lives. How does it take a hospital to think to take water from a different source, he asks them. What kind of backwards logic is that? The governments agree to meet at the banks of the river, and are surprised to learn what they always assumed to be true was nothing but a horror story. Over time, they reach out to the other cities and discover the city of stone, with a quarry in the center, taught that the deep mine was the only source of fresh water. The city of blood, with a theater in the middle, where they were taught that the charismatic actors had calmed the people enough to figure out where to find a new water supply. And the city of cunning, with a library at its heart, where, they're taught, the information of an alternate water supply was found. With the river poisoned by the meteorite, each part of the city had avoided it, until the forest grew over its banks. Over the generations, the stories had become more and more embellished, until each part of the original city feared the rest. If we wanted to, we could force a romantic subplot into this, but I'm not going to because I don't want to. We could also add a villain to the story who refuses to believe their prejudices could be wrong, or a conflict between cities based on a mutual misunderstanding. Either way, the Planet of Hats just became a lot more interesting. Thanks for watching this episode of Trope Turnaround. Let me know what underutilized trope you think would be interesting to build a story around. And if you liked the video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe.